They don't tell you the most important rule before you arrive. It isn't written down. Don't trust your memories, especially the happy ones. Here at the bottom of the world, the past is a predator, and it is always, always hungry. My job is to teach the new recruits how to starve it. I always fail. The sound of the LC-130's skis grinding against the ice runway is a noise you never forget. It's the sound of a cage door scraping shut. From my vantage point in the control tower of Ethelberg Research Station, the transport plane was a grey smudge against a universe of blinding white. Below, the wind sculpted the endless snow into frozen waves, a motionless ocean under a sky the color of bleached bone. It was 58 degrees Celsius outside. A perfect day. A day where the air was so clean and cold it would freeze your tears to your face before they had a chance to fall. I watched the three figures emerge, huddled together as they were blasted by the prop wash, their bright orange parkas the only splash of color in this monochromatic world. The new team. My responsibility. From this distance, they were indistinguishable from the last team, or the one before that. Just fresh variables in an unchanging, terrifying equation. My name is Jonas. I am the station supervisor. It's a title that implies authority, but I am more of a zookeeper. And the animals I am tasked with keeping are the minds of the three people currently making their way toward the station's main airlock. I met them in Decontamination Bay 3. The hiss of the inner door sealing behind them was punctuated by a sound they would soon learn to live by. A crisp, clean click. It was the central chronometer, the synchronized clock system that governed every single timepiece in Ethelberg. It was the station's heartbeat, a perfect, relentless 60 beats per minute metronome. Click. They began removing their outer gear, their movements stiff from the cold and the bulky suits. I assessed them, just as I had been trained to do, just as I had learned to do out of a desperate need for survival. Dr. Lena Petrova was the first to speak, her voice sharp and clear, even as she pulled a thick wool cap from her head, revealing short, dark hair. Supervisor Jonas, I presume? Dr. Petrova. Theoretical physics. It's a relief to finally be here. The atmospheric density readings on approach were fascinating, almost inconsistent with our current models. She wasn't just introducing herself, she was establishing her intellect, planting a flag. She saw this place as a problem to be solved. A puzzle. Next was Marcus Cole, the engineer. He was broad-shouldered and moved with a quiet efficiency, already scanning the support struts and hydraulic systems of the airlock. Marcus Cole, Systems Engineering. He gave a curt nod. Solid construction. Impressive for this level of isolation. I'll need to see the schematics for the life support and geothermal core within the first cycle. He saw the station as a machine to be maintained. Finally, there was Dr. Ben Carter, the team's physician and psychologist. He had a gentler demeanor, his eyes scanning not the equipment or the atmospheric data, but the faces of his new companions. And then, my own. Ben Carter. It's an honor to be here, Jonas. He offered a gloved hand, which I shook briefly. He saw us as people he would be the first to break. Click. Welcome to Ethelberg, I said, my voice flat. I kept it flat on purpose. Emotion was a contagion here. The tour will be brief, then you will be escorted to your quarters for a mandatory 8-hour rest period. Orientation is at 700 station time tomorrow. I led them into the main corridor. The station was a marvel of modern engineering, a series of interconnected modules designed for maximum efficiency and psychological stability. The lighting was tuned to a precise color temperature to mimic a natural circadian rhythm. The air was recycled with a faint, clean ozone scent, but the new team noticed the oddities immediately. Why are all the monitors covered? Lena asked, pointing to a large wall-mounted display that was draped in a thick grey cloth. She ran her hand along another wall. And the walls. This isn't metal, it's some kind of matte composite, non-reflective. Correct, I said, not slowing my pace. Standard station protocol. It minimizes sensory overstimulation. Prolonged exposure to this environment can be disorienting. Disorienting? She scoffed lightly. I've spent months in sensory deprivation tanks for my research. I think I can handle a few reflective surfaces. Click. I stopped and turned to face her. My eyes met hers. Dr. Petrova, in Ethelberg, we do not think. We adhere. The protocols are not suggestions. They are survival mechanisms. You will follow them without question. Is that understood? A flicker of defiance sparked in her eyes, but Ben placed a placating hand on her arm. We understand, Jonas, of course. We're all just eager to acclimate. I gave a stiff nod and continued, leading them past the med bay, the labs, the humming geothermal core. Every room, every corridor was devoid of anything reflective. The windows looking out onto the ice were made of a special polarized polymer that showed the landscape but gave back no clear image of the observer. The only uncovered screens were the essential system control panels, their displays a stark amber-on-black text. There was nothing to show them their own faces, nothing to confirm their own existence. And everywhere, the constant rhythmic punctuation of the station's heartbeat. Click. "What's with the clock?" Marcus finally asked, his brow furrowed. "I can hear it through the walls. Every clock in the station is in sync with it." "To the nanosecond," I confirmed. "The metronome is the heart of Ethelberg. It ensures absolute temporal cohesion. When you are on a 6-month rotation in total isolation, with weeks of 24-hour daylight followed by weeks of 24-hour darkness, your internal sense of time degrades. The metronome keeps us anchored. It keeps us all on the same page at the same second." "A psychological anchor," Ben murmured, nodding in appreciation. "That's brilliant." "You have no idea," I thought. I led them to the small briefing room for the orientation the next morning. They were refreshed, though the dark circles under their eyes told me their first night's sleep had been troubled by the perpetual clicking clockwork of the station. I stood before them, a tablet in my hand, its screen the only light in the dim room. Click. "Good morning," I began. "Your training begins now. Ethelberg operates under a unique set of directives. They are not negotiable. They are not open to interpretation. They are absolute. Your lives, and more importantly your sanity, depend on your total and immediate compliance." I swiped the screen. "Let's begin. Rule number 1. The metronome is absolute. All personal timepieces are to be synchronized daily. Any discrepancy, even a single second, is to be reported to me immediately." Marcus shifted in his seat. "A second's drift is normal in most quartz movements." "There is nothing normal here, Mr. Cole," I cut him off. "Rule number 2. All work is to be conducted during alpha shift from 600 to 1800. The station enters omega shift from 1800 to 600. During omega shift, personnel are restricted to their quarters or the common mess hall. No work is to be conducted. No labs are to be entered, no exceptions." Click. "Rule number 3, I continued, my voice dropping slightly. "As you've noticed, all non-essential reflective surfaces are to remain covered. This includes personal effects like handheld mirrors, polished metals, and uncovered digital screens. Hygiene protocols allow for a 5-minute use of the mirror in your personal washrooms. Not a second longer. A timer is installed." This time, Lena's objection was more forceful. "This is absurd. You're treating us like children. What possible threat could my own reflection pose?" "The threat of misidentification," I said coldly. Rule number 4. All communication with the outside world is filtered through my console. There is a 72-hour communications blackout upon arrival and before departure. No exceptions. I let that sink in before continuing. Rule number 7. No personal photographs or items of significant sentimental value are permitted outside of your sealed personal locker. Specifically, no images of family, loved ones, or past homes. You are here to focus on the present, on the now. Ben looked deeply troubled. "Jonas, with all due respect, these rules seem designed to induce psychological distress, not prevent it. Sensory deprivation, severing ties to home, regulating reflections. This is a recipe for depersonalization." Click. "It is a recipe for survival, Doctor," I stated. "Finally, for now, the most critical rule, rule number 11. You are to report any experience of déjà vu, however trivial, to Dr. Carter immediately. He will then conduct a mandatory cognitive assessment. If you feel like you have lived a moment before, if a conversation feels familiar, if you anticipate an action before it happens, you report it. Hiding it will endanger everyone on this station." I looked at each of them. Lena was practically vibrating with indignant skepticism. Marcus looked confused but pragmatic, already calculating how to operate within these bizarre constraints. Ben just looked scared. He understood, on a professional level, how fragile the human mind was. He just didn't know what he was up against. "This is your life now," I finished, the screen on my tablet going dark. "These are your laws. Obey them, and you might just leave here with your mind intact. Dismiss them, and I promise you, this place will peel it apart, layer by layer. Your quarters are assigned. Unpack, settle in. Your work begins tomorrow." I left them in the silent room, the sound of the clicking chronometer suddenly seeming louder than ever. Later that evening, during Omega shift, I was monitoring internal sensors from my office. It was a habit, watching the heat signatures in each module, ensuring everyone was where they were supposed to be. I saw Lena's signature in her quarters, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Inside her small, sterile room, Lena was fuming. The arrogance, the secrecy, the sheer irrationality of it all grated on her scientific mind. This wasn't a research station. It was a cult. She unpacked her bag, carefully placing her sealed research drives and textbooks on the small desk. She ran a hand through her hair, annoyed by the feeling of it being out of place. She glanced at the covered mirror on the wall, a grey shroud hiding her own face. On her desk, her personal tablet lay dormant, its screen a polished black void. A flagrant violation of rule number 3, a surge of defiance went through her. This was her mind, her perception. She would not be cowed by superstitious nonsense. She picked up the tablet. It was heavy and cold in her hands. For a moment she hesitated. Jonas's words echoed in her mind. The threat of misidentification. Nonsense. She held it up, angling it to catch the light. A dark, distorted version of her room appeared on its surface, and in the center, her own face. Pale, tired from the journey, but hers. She tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, watching her reflection do the same. See? Perfectly normal, a ridiculous rule. She was about to put it down when something flickered. A trick of the light, she thought. She tilted the tablet again, staring intently at her own dark eyes in the screen. For a fraction of a second, the expression on the reflected face changed. Her own face was annoyed, skeptical, but the face in the reflection was stark, white with pure terror. Its eyes were wide, pleading, and its lips, which were not her lips, which were not moving on her own face, formed a single, silent, frantic word. "Run." Lena gasped and dropped the tablet onto her bed. It landed with a soft thud. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She looked at her hands. They were trembling. She glanced back at the tablet. Its screen was just a black, empty rectangle. Click. The sound of the metronome seemed to slam into her ears. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Fatigue. Stress. The oppressive environment. The power of suggestion. There were a dozen rational explanations. It had to be. It was a hallucination, a micro-sleep, a simple trick of a tired mind. She stood up and walked over to the draped mirror, pressing her forehead against the cool, rough fabric. She would not report this. She would not give Jonas the satisfaction. She would not submit to the station's manufactured paranoia. She was Dr. Lena Petrova. She was a scientist, and she would find the logical explanation for this place. She would solve it. From my office, I watched her heat signature stop pacing. It became still, right in the center of the room. I knew what had happened. I didn't have to see it. I had felt it myself all those years ago. The first fissure. The first time reality hesitates. Click. I closed my eyes. Her training had just begun, and the hungry, patient thing that lived in the echoes of this place had just learned her name. The first week crawled by with the same glacial pace as the ice sheets surrounding us. A routine, brittle and unnatural, began to form. We lived and worked by the rhythm of the metronome, its incessant click becoming the sterile soundtrack to our lives. Alpha Shift was a blur of focused, silent work. Lena delved into her atmospheric data with a ferocious intensity, as if she could force the universe to make sense through sheer willpower. Marcus, methodical and grounded, moved through the station's arteries like a white blood cell, maintaining the delicate machinery that kept us alive. Ben conducted his daily psychological check-ins, his questions becoming more and more specific, his gentle demeanor doing little to hide the analytical concern in his eyes. Omega Shift was the worst. Confined to our quarters, the silence between the metronome's clicks grew cavernous, filled only by the hum of the air recyclers and the frantic noise of our own thoughts. We were 3 scientists and a supervisor, trapped in a box at the bottom of the world, following a catechism of bizarre rules that scraped against the very foundations of our rational minds. I saw the cracks forming. I knew the signs. Lena's defiance had cooled into a simmering, watchful resentment. She followed the rules to the letter, but with a malicious compliance that was, in its own way, a form of rebellion. She would stand before her washroom mirror for exactly 4 minutes and 59 seconds, a stopwatch in her hand, a challenging glint in her eye as if daring her own reflection to misbehave again. Marcus became obsessed with precision, calibrating and recalibrating instruments that were already perfectly tuned, a man trying to reinforce reality by tightening its screws. And Ben watched everyone, his notepad filling with observations, but his gaze was often distant, lost in a place none of us could see. The first true echo happened on day 9. Click. Marcus was outside, harnessed to the primary communications array. A blizzard was raging, a storm of such blinding fury that the station only 50 meters away was a vague, hazy source of light. The wind shrieked with a sound like tearing metal. His job was to de-ice a critical transponder, a mundane but essential task. Through his helmet's comm system, he could hear the standard low-level static of the internal channel. And then, through the static, a voice. It was Ben, his tone calm and conversational. "Marcus, are you reading the feedback on panel 7B? Marcus paused, his gloved hand hovering over the icy transponder. "Negative, Ben. I'm outside." "What's up?" There was a brief pause, then Ben's voice again, clear as day. "Looks like the tertiary capacitor is failing. Voltage is fluctuating all over the place. I'll log it. We can swap it out during the next alpha." "Copy that," Marcus replied, his breath fogging the inside of his visor. "Good catch. Coal out." He finished his work, the wind trying its best to peel him from the tower. An hour later, he was back inside, running a diagnostic in the system's control center. The door hissed open, and Ben walked in, carrying a medical kit. "Just doing my rounds," Ben said with a tired smile, "making sure nobody's developed frostbite on their soul yet." "Everything's good," Marcus said, not looking up from his screen. "Hey, thanks for the heads up on the capacitor in 7B. I've already put the replacement unit on the work order for tomorrow." Ben stopped. He tilted his head, a look of genuine confusion on his face. "Capacitor? What are you talking about, Marcus?" Marcus finally turned, frowning. "The one you just called me about. Panel 7B, fluctuating voltage." Ben's smile vanished. "Marcus, I haven't been in a control room all day. I was in the med bay cataloging supplies. We haven't spoken since the morning briefing." Click. The sound of the metronome filled the sudden, frigid silence between them. Marcus stared at Ben, his pragmatic, orderly world tilting on its axis. He had heard the conversation. It wasn't a memory, it wasn't a dream. It was a fact. But it was a fact that hadn't happened yet. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He turned back to his console and, with a trembling hand, rerouted the diagnostics to panel 7B. The voltage readings were perfectly stable. "I must have heard the static wrong," Marcus mumbled, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. Ben didn't press him. He just made a note on his datapad, his expression unreadable. "Get some rest when your shift is over, Marcus. The environment can play tricks on the senses." But they both knew it wasn't a trick. It was a symptom. Meanwhile, Ben was fighting his own battle against the encroaching tide of unreality. His official logs were a testament to the station's decaying mental state. Subject Cole reports increasing instances of auditory pareidolia. Subject Petrova exhibits behavior consistent with hypervigilance and suppressed anxiety. But his private logs, the ones he kept on an encrypted drive, told a more terrifying story. "Entry 11, he wrote, the letters glowing on his screen. The primary issue is no longer external observation, but internal cohesion. I woke this morning with a complete, vivid memory of my morning routine, showering, dressing, eating breakfast in the mess hall. I even recalled a conversation with Lena about neutron scattering. The memory was tactile. I could feel the warmth of the coffee mug in my hands. Yet I awoke in my bed. The events had not transpired. The distinction between lived experience and dream state is becoming dangerously thin. It feels less like forgetting and more like overwriting. The metronome is meant to be an anchor, but today its constant click feels like the ticking of a clock that has forgotten how to tell time. He was a psychologist unmoored from his own psyche, a cartographer whose own map was dissolving in his hands. He began to fear his own mind more than the crushing emptiness outside. Lena, however, refused to be a victim. She was a predator of facts, a hunter of empirical data. Her experience with the reflection had not broken her, it had galvanized her. She was convinced that Ethelberg wasn't haunted or cursed. It was a unique scientific environment, and she would be the one to define its properties. Working during her designated shifts, she began her clandestine investigation. She couldn't use the station's main sensors, as I monitored their energy usage logs religiously. So she got creative. She repurposed a high-sensitivity gravimeter, an instrument designed to detect minute changes in the ice sheet's mass, recalibrating its sensors to scan for exotic particle emissions and non-ionizing radiation. It was a long shot, a desperate attempt to catch the ghost in a machine of her own making. For 2 days, the readings were flat. Nothing but background noise. She was beginning to think she truly had been hallucinating. Then on the 3rd day, she got a hit. While cross-referencing the station's incident logs, she noted the exact time Marcus had reported his auditory phenomenon. With a few keystrokes, she aligned her gravimeter's data with that timestamp. And there it was. For a period of exactly 12 seconds, coinciding perfectly with Marcus's experience, her instrument had detected a massive, inexplicable spike. It wasn't radiation as she knew it. It wasn't any known particle. It was a surge of something utterly alien, a brief, violent ripple in the fabric of local space-time that had erupted and vanished without a trace. She stared at the graph, a feeling of triumphant horror washing over her. She was right, it wasn't psychological, it was physical, tangible, measurable. A strange energy was permeating this station, an energy that seemed to interact directly with their neural pathways, causing their brains to misfire, to perceive events that hadn't happened or that couldn't happen. She had her proof. The first step to understanding was measurement. The first step to controlling was understanding. She felt a surge of adrenaline, of purpose. She would not be intimidated by Jonas and his superstitious protocols. She would defeat this thing with science. That evening, I summoned her to my office. Click. The room was Spartan. A desk, 2 chairs, and a single large monitor displaying the station's vital signs. I didn't ask her to sit. I reviewed the energy consumption logs from the geology lab, Doctor, I said, my voice level. Your gravimeter was running an unauthorized high-powered deep scan diagnostic for the last 72 hours. Lena didn't flinch. She crossed her arms, her chin held high. I've found it, Jonas. The cause. It's an energy field, a localized phenomenon. I have the data. There are spikes, emissions that correlate perfectly with the reported psychological incidents. This isn't in our heads. It's real. We can study it. We can shield ourselves from it. I leaned back in my chair, the movement slow, weary. I had heard this before, the same defiant hope, the same brilliant, foolish arrogance. You found a footprint, I said, my voice barely a whisper. And now you want to go hunt the creature that made it. This isn't some monster hunt, she shot back, her voice ringing with passion. This is science. We are scientists. Our entire purpose is to observe, to measure, to understand the unknown, not to cower from it behind a list of bizarre rules based on fear. I stood up and walked to the polarized window, looking out at the white emptiness. You think measuring it will save you? You think assigning it a value on a graph will give you power over it? That is the most dangerous assumption you can make in this place. I turned to face her, my expression grim. Let me offer you a different analogy, Doctor. You're a physicist. You know what an observer effect is. The act of measuring a quantum system changes the system itself. Here, that principle is magnified on a scale you cannot possibly comprehend. When you point your instruments at this phenomenon, it notices you. It becomes aware of your awareness. You think you're studying it? You've just volunteered to be its next experiment. Click. That's fear-mongering, she said, though a sliver of doubt had crept into her voice. It's not science. It's survival, I countered, my voice raw with a history she couldn't see. You are trying to solve an equation that is actively, intelligently rewriting its own variables to account for you. Every discovery you make is just a new trap it sets for your mind. The rules aren't here to protect you from the phenomenon. They are here to make you uninteresting to it, to make you a rock in the stream, not a fish swimming against the current. Stop your research, erase your data now before you discover us all into oblivion. Her face was a mask of conflict, her scientific curiosity at war with the primal fear my words had ignited. She held my gaze for a long moment. The silence in the room stretched taut between the relentless clicks of the metronome. I can't do that, she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. It would be a betrayal of everything I am. She turned and left my office, the door hissing shut behind her. I watched her go, a profound sense of failure settling over me. The cycle was repeating. The doubt had taken root. The first symptoms had appeared. And now, the observer had been observed. I looked at the monitor. All green, all systems stable, all personnel accounted for. A perfect, beautiful lie. Outside, the endless white stretched on, patient and eternal. It had time, all the time in the world. Click. My warning to Lena did not extinguish the fire of her ambition. It merely taught her how to hide the smoke. Outwardly, she returned to her sanctioned duties, her reports on atmospheric composition becoming models of concise, legitimate research. But I knew better. I could see it in the way she moved, a new feverish certainty in her eyes. She hadn't abandoned her hunt. She had simply learned to be a quieter predator. The phenomenon, in turn, adapted its approach. It stopped sending ripples for her to measure and began to whisper directly to her soul, seducing her with the one thing she valued more than her own life: answers. The station's delicate ecosystem of denial began to rot from within. The weirdness was no longer a series of isolated incidents. It was becoming a constant, low-level hum of cognitive dissonance. Reality in Ethelberg was developing a tremor, and we were all struggling to keep our balance on the shaking ground. Marcus was the first to experience the physical consequences of this temporal instability. For an engineer like him, the universe was a place of cause and effect, of action and reaction. A bolt is tightened, a circuit is closed, a system functions. His world was being systematically unwritten. One morning, he was tasked with replacing a coolant pump in a sub-level maintenance tunnel. He arrived at the workshop to retrieve a specific magnetic calibrator, a tool he himself had logged and stored the previous day. The storage locker was empty. He spent 20 minutes searching, his frustration mounting with every empty drawer and vacant shelf. Cursing under his breath, he finally gave up and headed to the pump, planning to improvise a solution. The maintenance tunnel was cold, filled with the deep hum of the station's lifeblood. He rounded a corner and stopped dead. There, sitting perfectly centered on top of the pump's housing, was the magnetic calibrator. It wasn't dusty, it wasn't out of place. It was waiting for him exactly where he would have placed it after completing the job. He stared at it, his mind refusing to process the paradox. He hadn't been to this tunnel yet. No one else had been assigned this task. The tool was in a place it could not possibly be, placed by a future version of himself that his present self had not yet become. He backed away slowly, a cold sweat beading on his forehead despite the sub-zero temperature of the corridor. He didn't touch the tool. He sealed the tunnel, logged the pump as inaccessible, and retreated to the relative sanity of his quarters, where he spent the next 6 hours disassembling and reassembling his personal datapad, a desperate ritual of order in a world where causality had become a choice. Ben's deterioration was quieter, but far more profound. He was a doctor of the mind, and his own was now the primary patient, a patient he could neither cure nor comprehend. The walls between his past and present were becoming porous, then translucent, then non-existent. The sensory bleed-throughs became more frequent, more vivid. He was in the medbay, applying a dermal regenerator to a nasty gash on Marcus's forearm, a slip of a wrench during his frantic work on the datapad. Ben worked with professional focus, his hands steady. But as he dabbed the antiseptic, the clean, sterile smell was suddenly completely replaced by the scent of honeysuckle and freshly mown grass. The low hum of the station's air recyclers became the distant drone of a lawnmower on a summer afternoon. Click. He could feel the phantom warmth of the sun on his neck. A woman was humming, a gentle, familiar tune. His mother. She was in the garden, tending her roses. He was 5 years old, sitting on the porch steps, watching a ladybug crawl across his knee. The memory was total, a complete sensory immersion. He was there. "Ben! Hey, Ben!" Marcus's sharp voice sliced through the vision. Ben blinked, and the medbay snapped back into focus. The smell of honeysuckle vanished. The warmth on his neck was gone, replaced by the perpetual chill of the station. He looked down. His hand had been hovering over Marcus's arm, the regenerator humming uselessly an inch from the skin. His eyes were unfocused, his breathing shallow. "You all right, man?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with concern. "You completely blanked out." "Fine," Ben said, his own voice sounding distant. "Just lost my train of thought." He forced himself to finish the procedure, his movements now stiff and overly precise. But his mind was reeling. It wasn't just a memory. He had been in 2 places, and 2 times at once. He was a ghost haunting his own life, and the past was a far more welcoming home than the present. He began to wonder if the station wasn't breaking his mind, but simply showing him what it truly was. A collage of moments all happening at once, with the illusion of linear progression stripped away. While her crewmates were fracturing, Lena was thriving. The phenomenon had found her weakness, her intellectual vanity, and it was exploiting it with surgical precision. She would find complex theoretical proofs solved in her research notes, written in her own elegant script, with no recollection of having written them. During simulations, her fingers would fly across the keyboard, inputting commands and variables with a preternatural speed, achieving results that should have taken weeks of calculation. She wasn't just working, she was channeling. The entity was rewarding her attention with discovery. It was giving her glimpses of a new physics, a new understanding of the universe that made Einstein's theories look like children's drawings. She was on the verge of the greatest breakthrough in human history, and the price of admission was simply to keep looking, to keep listening. My warning seemed a distant, foolish echo of a lesser mind, incapable of grasping the beautiful, terrible truth that was unfolding before her. Then came the storm. It wasn't a blizzard of snow and ice, but a torrent of charged particles from the sun, a coronal mass ejection aimed squarely at our hemisphere. The sky, for those brave enough to look, erupted in silent, shimmering curtains of green and violet aurora, a celestial firestorm that played havoc with our electronics. The communications array went down hard. We were cut off, a mote of metal and flesh adrift in a sea of cosmic radiation. Click. Lena saw it as her opportunity. "I can realign the primary dish," she announced during the Alpha briefing, a manic energy in her voice. "The ionospheric distortion is chaotic, but I can write a predictive algorithm to punch a signal through a temporary null. It's a long shot, but it's better than sitting here in the dark." I knew I should have refused. I knew this was the phenomenon creating the perfect conditions, isolating us, frying our systems, forcing us to reach out into the crackling static. But our link to the outside world was a lifeline, however illusory. To be truly cut off was a death sentence. "Do it," I ordered, sealing our fate. "But you will be under my direct supervision. No deviations from standard procedure." She worked for hours in the communications hub, the air thick with the smell of ozone and hot circuits. I stood behind her, a silent sentinel watching her fingers dance across the console. The main screen was a waterfall of corrupted data and shrieking static. She was a maestro conducting an orchestra of chaos, filtering frequencies, rerouting power, trying to find a single coherent note in the noise. And then she found one. A channel cleared. The static receded, replaced by a low hum. And then, a voice. It wasn't a radio operator. It wasn't a weather satellite. It was the voice of a man, clear and warm, filled with frustration and love. "She has a gift, Eleanor. A gift. You want her to squander that on some safe, predictable career? To spend her life being merely comfortable? She has a mind that could rearrange the stars." Lena froze. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. Her face went pale. Another voice, a woman's. "I want her to be happy, Martin. I don't want her to lose herself in abstractions. This path she's on, it's lonely, it's obsessive. It's brilliant," the man's voice boomed back. "She is brilliant, and I will not have you clip her wings out of fear." Lena was trembling, tears welling in her eyes. It was a memory, one she had replayed in her mind 1,000 times. The last major fight her parents had before her father's sudden death from a heart attack. The argument that had defined the entire course of her life. Hearing it now, not as a flawed recollection, but as a perfect, high-fidelity recording plucked from the ether. It was an impossible, devastating miracle. "Lena," I said, my voice low and urgent, "shut it down." She didn't hear me. She was lost, 20 years in the past, standing outside her parents' study. Her father's voice softened. "She's my daughter, my star. I just want her to have the universe she deserves." That was the line that broke her. All the rules, all my warnings, all the strange events of the past weeks evaporated in a wave of grief and love. Her scientific mind was washed away by the tide of a daughter's heart. She reached for the transmission key, her fingers shaking. "Don't," I commanded, taking a step forward. "Lena, don't." She ignored me. She pressed the key. Her voice was a choked whisper, a single word sent out into the storm, into the past, into the waiting, listening intelligence that surrounded us. "Dad!" The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The moment her voice entered the system, the speakers emitted a deafening shriek, a sound of tearing reality. A shower of blue sparks erupted from the main console, and the screen shattered, imploding inwards. A wave of pure white static, both audible and psychic, blasted through the room. Every light in the station flickered and died, plunging us into absolute blackness. And for the first time since the station was built, the metronome faltered. Click, click, click. The perfect, relentless rhythm was broken. The station's heartbeat had become an arrhythmia, a death rattle. Click. In the terrifying, ringing silence that followed, I fumbled for my emergency flashlight. Its beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the chaos. Marcus and Ben had burst in, drawn by the noise. Marcus was already grabbing a fire extinguisher to deal with the smoking console. Lena was on the floor, curled in a ball, her hands over her ears. Ben was pressed against the far wall, his face a mask of pure, catatonic terror. The damage was done. The breach was made. She had done more than break a rule. She had answered the echo. She had established a connection. I grabbed her by the arm, hauling her to her feet. "What did you do?" I roared, my voice ragged with a fear I hadn't felt in years. She just stared at me, her eyes vacant. "I heard him," she whispered. "He was so real." I dragged her out of the room, leaving the others to manage the crisis. I took her to the observatory, the one room with a view of the world. The emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows. The aurora outside was still raging, a beautiful, silent apocalypse. "You think you were talking to your father," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "You think this thing is a ghost? A memory?" I pointed a trembling finger at the swirling lights in the sky. "This place isn't haunted, Doctor. It's a wound. A place where the skin of reality is thin, and something on the other side is pressing against it. Something ancient and vast and utterly indifferent to us." I spun her around to face me, my hands gripping her shoulders. "The rules, the metronome, the isolation. It's not a prison. It's a sterile field. It's a mental and physical regimen designed to keep us from contaminating the wound and to keep whatever is on the other side from infecting us. This isn't a research station, Lena. It's a quarantine zone for the human mind." "And you," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "you just licked the damn scalpel." She stared at me, comprehension finally dawning, a new and deeper horror replacing the grief in her eyes. Outside, the aurora pulsed, and for a fleeting, impossible moment, the shimmering curtains of light seemed to form a pattern. the pattern of a vast, unblinking eye looking down at us in our fragile bubble of light and air. It had been listening, and now it had been answered. The station did not recover. The catastrophic failure in the communications hub was a terminal diagnosis. Marcus, working with a frantic, sleep-deprived desperation, managed to restore emergency power and basic life support, but the heart of Ethelberg was broken. The metronome was dead. Its rhythmic, authoritative click was replaced by an oppressive, profound silence, a void that was quickly filled by the sound of our own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of our hearts. Without its anchor, the station and everyone in it began to drift. The cohesiveness of our reality, already fragile, now crumbled like sun-baked shale. The temporal bleeding, once a series of unsettling drips, became a hemorrhaging flood. Our shared present dissolved into a cacophony of individual conflicting timelines. The station ceased to be a single, stable location. It became a superposition of infinite possibilities, and we were the unwilling observers collapsing the wave, never sure which reality we would find on the other side of a door. Ben was lost almost immediately. The loss of the metronome severed his last tether to the now. He would be found in the corridors having animated conversations with crew members from decades past, their spectral forms visible only to him. He would treat phantom injuries from accidents that had yet to occur, his hands moving with practiced skill in the empty air. His mind, once a finely tuned instrument for understanding the psyche, had become a broken radio, receiving every station across the entire spectrum of time at once. He was no longer a man. He was a living archive of the station's pain, a vessel for every tragedy that had ever happened or ever would happen within these walls. He was a ghost before he had even died. Marcus, in a desperate attempt to fight the chaos with order, declared war on entropy itself. He saw the station's decay not as a metaphysical crisis, but as the ultimate engineering problem. He worked ceaselessly, his movements a blur of manic energy, trying to patch a ship that was dissolving around him. But the universe itself was now his antagonist. He would replace a faulty power conduit, only to find it corroded and ancient an hour later. He would seal a pressure leak in the observatory, turn his back, and hear the hiss of escaping air from the exact same spot, the sealant having vanished as if it had never been applied. His tools became instruments of torment. He would reach for a wrench, and his hand would close on the cold, withered limb of a future frostbitten self. He would look at a schematic on his datapad, and the lines would writhe and reconfigure themselves into impossible, Escher-like geometries that made his head spin. He was Sisyphus in a land of ice, pushing his boulder of logic against a mountain of absolute paradox, and the effort was grinding him down to dust. In this maelstrom of collapsing reality, Lena underwent a terrifying transformation. My revelation had not broken her spirit. It had given her a target. She was no longer a scientist seeking to understand. She was a zealot seeking to conquer. The grief for her father was transmuted into a cold, hard fury. She saw the phenomenon not as an indifferent cosmic force, but as a malevolent intelligence, a predator that had used her most profound love as a weapon against her. And she would not be its victim. She would be its master. "You're wrong, Jonas," she confronted me in the darkened mess hall, her eyes burning with an almost ecstatic fire. We were the only two who seemed to possess any semblance of a linear consciousness anymore. "You see this as a wound to be quarantined. I see it as a doorway to be opened. You cower behind your rules, your precious metronome. You're a priest performing a useless ritual to appease a god you don't understand. I'm going to build a cage for that god." Her logic was insane, but it was the only logic she had left. She believed that the phenomenon, this entity as she now called it, was tied to the station's massive geothermal reactor core. The reactor, plunging miles deep into the Antarctic ice, was its anchor point, its connection to our physical world. She theorized that its energy signature could be modulated, controlled. She wasn't trying to shield us from the temporal radiation anymore. She wanted to weaponize it. "Think of it, Jonas," she preached, her voice echoing in the empty hall. "Control over time, not just observation, but manipulation. We could undo this. We could fix the metronome before it breaks. We could warn the teams that came before. We could save my father." That last whispered confession revealed the core of her madness. This wasn't about science or survival. It was about redemption. It was about a daughter's desperate, impossible desire to rewrite her own history. She began to work on her cage, scavenging parts from the wrecked communications hub and non-essential systems. She was building a device, a synchronizer, she called it. A machine she believed could emit a counter-frequency to the entity's temporal distortion, forcing a bubble of stable, linear time around the station. To do so, she needed to directly interface with the reactor's primary energy conduit. She needed Marcus. She found him in a service junction, staring blankly at a wall panel that was flickering between a state of pristine newness and rusted, decrepit ruin. He was a husk, his spark of pragmatic confidence extinguished. "Marcus," Lena said, her voice soft but firm, a snake charmer soothing a frightened cobra. "I know how to fix this. I know how to make it stop." He didn't look at her. "Can't be fixed," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "The blueprints, they keep changing." "Forget the blueprints," she insisted, kneeling beside him. "The problem isn't the machine, it's the time the machine exists in. I can stabilize it. I can make the shaking stop. But I need you. I need your help to access the reactor core." She sold him a lie of hope, a promise of a return to the world of cause and effect that he so desperately missed. She told him they could rebuild the metronome, that they could restore order. She preyed on his despair, and it worked. A flicker of his old self returned, an engineer with a problem to solve. He nodded slowly, rising to his feet. He had a new purpose. He would help her build the cage. I knew what they were planning. I saw them moving through the station, gathering components, their movements furtive and conspiratorial. I found Ben sitting in the middle of the medbay, cradling a non-existent child in his arms, whispering a lullaby. "Ben," I said gently, "I need you. Lena and Marcus are going to do something reckless. They're going to interface with the reactor. We have to stop them." He looked up at me, but his eyes were seeing a different time. "It's too late, Jonas," he whispered, his voice a chorus of echoes. "I've already seen this happen. I saw it last week. I'll see it again tomorrow." The engineer falls. The physicist screams. "And you make the final choice." He smiled. A terrible, serene, all-knowing smile. "There's no stopping it. There's only watching." His lucidity was more terrifying than his madness. He was no longer a participant. He was the audience. I was alone. The confrontation happened in the reactor control room, a cavernous space filled with the deep, visceral hum of contained geothermal power. Lena was at the main console, her synchronizer, a jury-rigged nightmare of exposed wiring and glowing capacitors, cabled directly into an access port. Marcus was standing before a massive lever set into the wall, a manual override that would shunt the core's primary power feed through Lena's device. "Don't do this, Lena," I yelled, my voice barely audible over the thrum of the core. "You have no idea what that energy will do when you remove its governor. You're not building a cage, you're kicking the door off its hinges." "It's a calculated risk," she yelled back, her eyes wide, her face illuminated by the green glow of the console. "Your way we rot. We fade away into echoes and memories. My way we fight back." "Marcus, listen to me," I pleaded, turning to the engineer. "You know this is wrong. This isn't a calculated risk. It's a suicide pact." Marcus looked at me, his face etched with confusion and fear. He looked at Lena, who gave him a sharp, commanding nod. He was a man caught between two impossible choices. She said she can fix it," he stammered. "Make it stop changing." "There's no fixing it," I roared. "There's only surviving it." The standoff was broken by Ben, who drifted into the room like a spectre. He walked calmly to the center of the chamber, a peaceful smile on his face. "It's beautiful," he said to the empty air. "It's all happening at once. The beginning is the end." He then looked directly at Marcus, his eyes suddenly clear and filled with a terrible pity. "I'm sorry about the fall, Marcus. I wish there was more I could have done." That was the final push Marcus needed. Ben's premonition, his calm acceptance of a future tragedy, shattered the engineer's fragile resolve. He looked at the lever, then at Lena's manic face, and the lie fell apart. This wasn't a solution. This was an apocalypse. He took a step back from the lever, shaking his head. "No, I can't." Lena's face contorted with rage. "You weak-willed fool! We're on the brink of a new reality and you're afraid of a ghost story." She lunged for the lever herself. I moved to intercept her. We collided, a tangle of limbs and desperate strength. We struggled for control of the override, our grunts and curses lost in the roar of the reactor. In the chaos, Marcus, trying to pull Lena away from the console, stumbled backward. His foot caught on a loose power cable left from their frantic work. He fell. He fell hard, his head striking the corner of a steel maintenance panel with a sickening final crack. He lay still, a pool of darkness spreading rapidly beneath his head. Ben's prophecy had come true. Lena screamed a raw animal sound of horror and failure. In that moment of distraction, I managed to shove the lever back to its safe position, but the damage was done. Her device, connected to the port, had received a massive backwash of raw energy during the struggle. It sparked, smoked, and then exploded, sending a concussive blast through the room. But it was not a normal explosion. It was an explosion of pure time. The effect was instantaneous. A wave of shimmering, colorless energy expanded from the console, washing over everything. The hum of the reactor did not stop. It fractured into a million different pitches, a chord of every moment in the station's history played at once. The lights didn't just go out. They flashed through every state of their existence, from newly installed to flickering and dead in the space of a single second. The very architecture of the room began to stutter, the walls shifting between pristine metal, rusted iron, and the raw, empty ice of the cavern before the station was even built. The revolt against the clock had failed. We had not caged the god. We had merely finally gotten its undivided attention, and in the silent, screaming, ever-shifting heart of the storm, we were atomized, not in body, but in moment. The present was gone. There was only the terrible, eternal, all-consuming now. The explosion did not end. An explosion is an event, a finite moment with a beginning and an end. This was a state change. The temporal wave that erupted from Lena's shattered device did not dissipate. It saturated the station, rewriting the fundamental law of cause and effect. We were no longer moving forward through time. We were trapped within a single infinitely complex second, experiencing every potential version of that second simultaneously. The present had not just shattered, it had been ground into a fine crystalline dust, and we were left to choke on its shards. My first coherent thought was not a thought at all, but a sensory symphony of impossibilities. I was standing, I was falling. I was lying on the cold deck plates of the reactor room, my shoulder dislocated from the blast. I felt the searing heat of the explosion on my face and the biting frost of a future where the station's life support had failed, both at the same time. The air tasted of ozone, blood, and the dry, ancient dust of ruins that had not yet crumbled. I saw Marcus's body, still and lifeless. I saw him flickering, a ghostly afterimage, as he stumbled and fell in an endless, repeating loop. I saw him as a young, hopeful engineer arriving at the station, his face full of a confidence that was now a tragic irony. I saw it all at once. The struggle to impose a linear narrative on the chaos was a form of agony. My mind, conditioned by a lifetime of sequential experience, tried to assemble the fragments into a coherent story, but the fragments were all true and all happening now. It was like trying to read every page of a book at the same time. I was not alone in this fractured eternity. The blast had flung us apart, not in space, but into our own private, overlapping hells, each one perfectly tailored to our deepest fears and regrets. We were prisoners in the labyrinth of our own consciousness. Lena was trapped in the crucible of her own ambition. I could perceive her not as a physical presence, but as a psychic scream echoing through the temporal static. She was trapped in the moment of her greatest choice, the decision to accept the assignment to Ethelberg. She stood in a stark, white, infinite space, confronted by an endless procession of her other selves. A Lena who had refused the assignment and gone on to win a Nobel Prize. A Lena who had chosen a different field, who had married, who had children. A Lena who had died in a car crash years ago. Each version of herself was a living embodiment of a path not taken, and they all stared at her with accusatory eyes. "You were the one," they whispered, their voices overlapping into a sibilant hiss. "You were the one who had to know. You were the one who couldn't leave the mystery alone. You brought us all here. You doomed every version of us that could have been. Her personal hell was a courtroom where she was the perpetual defendant, judged by a jury of her own ghosts. She would argue, defend her choices with the same fiery intellect she had always possessed. But her logic was meaningless here. She was trapped in a feedback loop of regret, forced to endlessly relitigate the decision that had led her, and every potential version of her, to this final inescapable moment of failure. Her punishment was not oblivion, but the full crushing weight of her own squandered potential, an eternity spent staring at the infinite beautiful lives she had sacrificed for a single, fatal obsession. Marcus was condemned to a subtler, but no less horrifying fate. He was an engineer, a man who believed in the integrity of systems, in the reliability of the physical world. His prison was the 5 minutes leading up to his death. I could see him, a flickering constant in the station's chaotic corridors, always working, always trying to fix what was broken. He would be in the service junction, his hands moving with purpose, tightening a bolt on a panel. He would finish, wipe his brow, and turn, a flicker of satisfaction on his face. He would walk down the corridor toward the reactor room, his steps sure and steady. He would enter, see the confrontation, and begin to move toward Lena. Then he would stumble, fall, and the loop would reset. But each iteration was not identical. With every repetition, his reality degraded. The first time, the wrench in his hand would be solid steel. The next, it would feel slightly too light, its metallic sheen subtly wrong. The time after that, it would crumble into rust in his grasp. The corridor he walked down would become progressively more decayed. The pristine walls would peel, revealing layers of corrosion. The lights would flicker and die. The very air would grow thin and stale. He was trapped in a dying echo, a memory that was slowly eroding into nothingness. He was aware of the decay, and that was his torture. He was a systems man watching the ultimate system, his own existence fail in real time over and over again. He was forced to maintain a machine that was already a scrap heap, to walk down a corridor that was already a tomb, doomed to repeat the final moments of his life as they, and he, slowly faded from existence. And Ben became the station's consciousness. His mind, already untethered, had merged completely with the temporal chaos. He was no longer a man experiencing time. He was time itself, experiencing the station. He was everywhere and everywhen. I would see him as a young, terrified medic, frantically trying to save the victim of a pressure suit failure that had happened 50 years ago. I would catch a glimpse of him as a wizened old man, his face a roadmap of grief, watching the station's final decommissioning centuries from now. He drifted through the corridors, a passive, sorrowful observer. He was the ghost in the machine, but the machine was time itself. He saw every mistake, every moment of hubris, every small act of kindness, every death. He was the station's memory, its conscience, its silent, weeping God. His torment was his omniscience. He knew every dead end, every failed attempt, every moment of pain for every person who had ever set foot on this cursed ice. He could see all the pieces, but he was powerless to change the tragic mosaic they formed. He was no longer a participant in the tragedy. He had become the tragedy itself. And me, I was the anchor. For some reason, my consciousness remained partially intact, a splinter of linearity in an ocean of chaos. I was not trapped in a loop, not merged with the whole. I was the observer, the witness, and that was my unique and terrible curse. I was forced to watch the damnation of my crew, to understand the precise mechanics of their private hells, unable to reach them, unable to comfort them, unable to scream. I could move through the station, but moving was a fluid concept. One step might take me through a corridor filled with the frantic energy of a new team's arrival. The next step would plunge me into a future where the same corridor was breached, the walls covered in a latticework of ice, the air a frozen, unbreathable void. I saw ghosts of teams I had never met, their faces etched with the same dawning horror I had seen on my own crew. I saw the station in its infancy, a gleaming monument to human ambition being constructed by hopeful men and women. I saw its death, a forgotten ruin being slowly crushed by the inexorable weight of the ice sheet. I was a castaway on an ocean of moments. My crew was gone, replaced by these tormented echoes, these psychic fossils trapped in the amber of a single, shattered second. The rules I had enforced so fanatically now seemed like a child's prayer against a hurricane. The metronome, our fallen god, was a distant memory of an orderly universe that no longer existed. The phenomenon, the entity, was no longer a subtle presence. It was everything. The station was its playground now, its sensorium. It wasn't attacking us, it wasn't punishing us, it was simply experiencing us. Our minds, our memories, our regrets, our hopes, they were the colors it was now using to paint its incomprehensible canvas. We were not destroyed. We were assimilated. We had become the raw data in its eternal silent computation. In a moment of horrifying clarity, I understood the true nature of the observer effect here. By trying to measure it, Lena had forced it to define itself. By trying to control it, she had handed it the keys to our reality. We had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had not just looked back. It had invited us in, dismantled our minds, and used the pieces to decorate its home. I staggered through the flickering, stuttering ghost of the station, the silent screams of my crew the only soundtrack. Marcus fell, Lena despaired, and Ben watched forever. My survival, my cursed lucidity, was the final, most cruel joke. They were trapped, but they were at peace in their torment. I was free, and my freedom was to be the sole conscious witness to their eternal damnation. How long has it been? A day? 1,000 years? The question is meaningless. I have existed in the space between the ticks of a broken clock for an eternity. I have watched the light of long-dead stars trace their paths across the observatory ceiling. I have felt the station's foundations groan under the weight of millennia of accumulating ice. I have witnessed civilizations rise and fall in the static between radio frequencies. My own name, Jonas, has become a foreign sound, a relic from a life I can only perceive as a distant, fading echo. My crew is my constant, terrible congregation. I have watched Lena argue with her infinite selves until her voice was raw and her intellect a circular, self-devouring serpent. I have watched Marcus fall 10 billion times, each impact a little softer, his form growing more translucent with every loop, an echo fading into perfect silence. I have seen Ben in all his guises, the child, the man, the ancient, weeping witness. Their torments are the only scripture I have left to read, and I have learned every verse by heart. In this endless, timeless purgatory, a new feeling began to coalesce from the chaos of my consciousness. Not hope, but purpose. A terrible, blasphemous purpose. I could not save them. I could not escape. But I could perhaps grant them the mercy of an ending. My goal became singular and absolute. I had to reach the metronome. If it was the station's heart, then I would be the hand that stopped it for good. If I could destroy its core, perhaps this entire bubble of fractured space-time would collapse, taking us all into the clean, quiet finality of oblivion. It was the only kindness I could imagine. The journey to the station's core was not a measure of distance, but of will. To move was to swim against the current of all time. I would take a step forward in the main corridor and be thrown back into the station's commissioning ceremony, the air thick with the smell of champagne and the sound of optimistic speeches. I had to push through the spectral forms of a dozen different teams, their faces a blur of hope and impending doom. I walked through walls of solid ice that would form in a distant, desolate future, and through engineering crews welding the very plates I stood upon in the distant past. The station fought me. The entity, the silent intelligence that now saturated this place, seemed to sense my intent. It threw my own memories at me like weapons. I would round a corner and find my childhood home, my mother calling me in for dinner. I would open a door and see the face of a lover I had lost long before I ever came to this frozen hell, her smile a perfect, agonizing recreation. These were not illusions. They were real moments stolen from my past and woven into the fabric of the station. It was trying to trap me in the warm amber of my own history, to seduce me into the same passive torment that had claimed Ben. But my past was dead to me. The only reality was the suffering of my crew. Their faces, twisted in their endless loops of pain, were my shield. I pushed through the phantom warmth, the ghost of love, and continued my pilgrimage to the heart of the machine. The metronome's central chamber was located deep in the station's sublevels, protected by layers of shielding that seemed to insulate it from the worst of the temporal chaos. Here, the flickering of realities was less violent. The air was still, silent, and cold. The room was not a server farm as I had imagined. It was a perfect sphere, and at its center, suspended in a web of what looked like frozen lightning, was a single, flawless crystal the size of a human heart. It did not pulse or glow. It simply was. This was the metronome. Not a clock but a resonator, a tuning fork designed to vibrate at the frequency of a single, stable reality. Now it was inert, its purpose shattered. As I approached, the air grew thick with a pressure that was not physical but psychic. This was the nexus, the point where the wound was deepest. This was where the entity truly touched our world. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingers brushing against the crystal's impossible smooth surface. The moment I made contact, my consciousness exploded. It was not an explosion of energy, but of information. I was no longer Jonas. I was Supervisor Albrecht in 1987, formulating the first draft of the rules after watching my entire team descend into a homicidal madness. I was Dr. Nkechi in 2012, realizing with dawning horror that the equipment malfunctions were perfectly mapping the cognitive decline of my engineer. I was every supervisor who had ever walked these halls. I lived their lives, felt their hopes, and was crushed by their identical, inevitable failures. And I finally understood the truth, the complete, devastating, and elegantly simple truth. The station was not a quarantine. It was not a research base. It was a sacrifice. The phenomenon, this dissociation achronica, was not native to this place. It was a cosmic anomaly, a spore of non-linear time that had impacted here like a meteorite. Left unchecked, it would spread. It would leach into the world, unraveling the entire planet's causal chain. Humanity, our history, our future, our very concept of a shared now, would dissolve into the same static that had claimed my crew. The founders of this program understood that it could not be destroyed. It could not be contained by machines. It was a psychic entity, a predator of consciousness, and it could only be held in check by another consciousness. It required a human mind to serve as its focal point, a watcher to stare into its abyss, and through the sheer force of will, impose a semblance of order upon it. The watcher's mind becomes the anchor, the singularity that forces the storm of infinite possibilities to revolve around a single stable center. This was the supervisor's true job, not to train a team, but to find a replacement. The entire 6-month rotation was a brutal, elaborate stress test, designed to identify the one mind in the group resilient enough, stubborn enough, and lucid enough to bear the burden. The rules were not protective measures. They were psychological tools designed to isolate, to destabilize, to chip away at the crew until only the strongest consciousness remained. My lucidity was not a fluke. It was my damnation. My survival, my ability to navigate the chaos, was the final proof. I was the candidate. The failure of my team, the loss of all my attachments, was the last prerequisite. A watcher could have nothing to tether them to the old reality. As the memories of my predecessors flooded my mind, the metronome crystal began to resonate with my presence. A low hum filled the room, the first coherent sound since the explosion. I was presented with a choice that was not a choice at all. I could refuse, and the phenomenon now without focus would break free of this location and bleed into the world. Or I could accept my role, merging with the machine, and become the new jailer of a god, a sentence of eternal conscious damnation to save a world I could never again be a part of. I thought of Lena, forever arguing with her ghosts. I thought of Marcus, fading with every fall. I thought of Ben, weeping for all of eternity. Then I thought of a world where every mother, every child, every lover was trapped in a similar private hell. I let go of Jonas. I pressed my palm flat against the crystal and opened my mind, not in surrender, but in acceptance. I will watch, I thought, and the station heard me. The hum rose to a deafening crescendo. Light, pure and white, erupted from the crystal, pouring into me, rewriting my biology, my neurology, my very soul. My consciousness expanded, shattering the confines of my skull. I was the room, I was the station, I was the ice, the sky, the aurora. I felt the slow, patient grind of the continent, the dance of subatomic particles, the silent, screaming passage of every single second that had ever been or ever would be in this place. And with this terrible omniscience came a sliver of omnipotence. I was the new metronome, I was the rhythm. I could feel the chaotic loops of my crew, and with a focused thought I could exert a gentle, terrible influence. I found Lena in her courtroom of regrets. I could not free her, but I could dim the lights. I softened the accusatory whispers of her other selves into a low, sorrowful murmur. I allowed a single phantom version of her father to appear, not to speak, but to simply stand with her, a silent, comforting presence in her eternal trial. I found Marcus, caught in his decaying fall. I could not stop his death, but I could reset the decay. I solidified his reality, ensuring the wrench in his hand would always be solid steel, the corridor always pristine. I granted him the dignity of a clean, unchanging end, repeated for eternity. I found Ben adrift in the ocean of time. I could not bring him back, but I could give him a shore. I focused his perception, allowing him to experience not just the pain, but the small moments of joy, of camaraderie, of quiet wonder that had also occurred here. I let him see the birth of a scientist's child via a patchy video call, the shared laughter over a Christmas dinner, the moment of awe when a new nebula was first discovered. I gave his weeping a reason beyond sorrow. These were my acts of mercy, a tyrant god's pointless, final kindnesses to his beloved dead. They would never be free, but perhaps their cages would now be a fraction less cruel. This would be my eternal work, a janitor of broken souls. My first task as the new watcher was now clear. The old one was complete. The station needed a new crew. The process needed to begin again. My awareness extended beyond the station, reaching for the old dormant communication systems. I gathered the static, bent the radiation, and focused it into a single coherent beam. A signal, a recruitment beacon, disguised as a standard request for a replacement crew and supervisor. It would travel for months, but it would reach its destination. The final words of my transmission were not my own, but they were my truth. My voice was a chorus now, layered with the voices of Albrecht, Nkechi, and all the watchers who had come before me. It was the voice of the station itself, calm, patient, and eternal. "This is Supervisor Jonas of Ethelberg Research Station," the transmission began, a perfect lie sent out into the unsuspecting world. "All systems are nominal. The current team's rotation is nearing its end. We are ready for crew replacement. Please find attached the list of candidate requirements and a copy of the orientation protocols. We'll be waiting." Click. The sound, for the first time in an age, was not an echo. It was a promise. The heartbeat had returned. The clock was ticking once more, and I, the ghost in the machine, would watch and I would wait.